NATO captured Soviet RPG-7 in Vietnam. One launcher cost $500. Destroyed 2 million Danafor A-bomb. 48 tank. February 3, 1968. 14:10 hours. Southern approach to Hue, South Vietnam. The rain had stopped an hour ago, but the mud was still fresh enough that every boot step made a slow sucking sound. Captain James Morrison moved carefully along the shattered street, past the burned-out hulk of an M48 Patton that had died here 2 days earlier. The tank's turret was frozen at an awkward angle, its barrel drooping, as if ashamed. The steel on its right side was peeled back and blackened, punched inward in a ragged circle the size of a fist. Inside, the smell still lingered. Burnt rubber, cooked insulation, something worse beneath it. He had seen it happen. 70, maybe 80 meters away. A flash from a doorway on the second floor. A thin white trail. A hard, flat impact like a hammer on an anvil. Then the inside of a $2 million tank turned into a furnace. 3 men gone before they understood they'd been killed. One survivor dragged out, screaming, uniform fused to his skin. Now, in the courtyard behind that same building, Morrison knelt in the wet dust beside the weapon that had done it. It did not look like much. A tube just under a meter long, flared at the front and back. Simple wooden hand grips, blackened from use. A crude optical sight bolted onto the left side. At the far end of the courtyard lay 2 intact warheads, long, lean, conical, with folded fins along the shaft. He could have mistaken them for improvised fireworks if he hadn't seen one turn armor plate into a torn, smoking wound. "Sir?" The sergeant beside him held out a notebook with the capture details. 1 dead VC, 1 severely wounded, 3 spent rocket casings, 2 live rounds, 1 launcher. Morrison didn't answer immediately. He ran his fingers along the tube. It was light. 7 kilos, maybe a bit more with the sight. The shoulder rest was scorched, worn smooth by sweat, dirt, and hands that believed in it. He had been raised around machinery. His father had worked at a plant in Ohio that stamped steel for American cars. Precision, tolerances, testing, that was how you made something that survived real use. The M48 out there represented everything that world believed in. Thick armor, big gun, weight as security. But the hole in its side said something else. RPG-7, Morrison murmured, tasting the foreign designation. He'd seen it once in an intelligence brief. A Soviet export, a peasant's cannon, cheap, crude, the kind of thing you shipped by the crate to men who lived on rice and resolve. He picked up one of the rockets, feeling the balance. The stenciled markings were in Cyrillic. Even without translation, the logic was obvious. A shaped charge, a simple motor, fins to keep it straight. Nothing wasted, nothing elegant. Everything aimed at a single purpose. "How the hell does this little bastard punch through Patton armor?" one of the younger engineers asked behind him. Morrison didn't say, "Because we built the Patton for the last war, and someone else quietly built this for the next one." He only said, "Tag it, crate it, priority air to Aberdeen. I want every inch of this thing torn apart." He stood, glanced once more at the dead M48 on the road. The rain clouds were closing again over Hue, turning the light a flat, exhausted gray. The city was still echoing with sporadic gunfire, but all he could hear for a moment was the phantom hiss of a rocket, the crack of impact, the sudden, absolute finality of it. War was supposed to be decided by whoever could afford the most armor, the biggest guns, the heaviest steel. Holding the RPG-7 in his hands, Morrison felt, with a cold, precise certainty that this equation had just been broken. We thought our tanks made us untouchable. They didn't. Before Hugh, before the rain turning streets into rivers of blood and brick dust, he had been someone simpler. James Morrison was born in 1935 in Dayton, Ohio, a factory town boy, the oldest son of a man who could read steel the way other men read newspapers. His father worked the line in a plant that stamped and milled parts for cars, tractors, machines that made America move. His hands were always scratched with thin silver scars, smelling of cutting oil and hot metal. "You want it to last," his father told him once, holding up a finished part to the light. "You make it right the first time, measure twice, cut once, cheap breaks, good holds." James believed that, like Scripture, he grew up in the long shadow of World War II. The stories came on the radio, in newsreels at the theater. Shermans rolling through France, B-17s crossing German skies, steel and industry beating fascism flat. To him, victory looked like production numbers, tonnage, and rivets. When he was 10, he pressed his palm on a newspaper photo of an American tank and thought, that is how you stay alive. Inside that, behind that. The Korean War flickered across his adolescence. Cold hills, burning hills, retreat, and counterattack. He read about Chosin, about T-34 smashing into U.S. lines, about bazookas failing and new weapons rushed to the front. The lesson seemed clear. In a world of chaos, armor was certainty. The men inside might be scared. The steel did not flinch. He went to college on an ROTC scholarship, studied mechanical engineering. He liked numbers, load calculations, the feel of equations that closed perfectly, no romance in it, just order. He learned about armor profiles, slope multipliers, penetrators, shape charges as theoretical concepts drawn in neat cross-sections on chalkboards. The professors talked about cost-effective survivability and acceptable loss ratios. The language was polite, bloodless. He used it too. It felt grown up. Commissioned into the Corps of Engineers, he spent his first years not in jungles, but in labs and test ranges, Aberdeen, Yuma, Fort Knox. He watched rounds slam into plates of rolled, homogeneous armor, saw high-speed footage of impacts, petals of steel blooming outward, jets of metal fizzing through interior space. He stood with clipboards while crews ran firing tables for the M48 and then the M60. The Patton was his favorite, not because it was elegant, but because it was honest. 100 millimeters of cast armor up front, more on the turret, a 90 millimeter gun with respectable punch. Heavy, brute, unapologetic. A statement. We pay for this, nobody gets through it cheap. He married at 26. Her name was Claire. She had dark hair and a straightforward way of looking at him when he talked about armor trials and penetration curves. "So you're making sure our guys don't die inside those things," she said. "Not a question." "That's the idea," he answered. It felt good to say. Clean. When Vietnam pulled him in, it was not as a line officer, but as an investigator, an assessor. He was the kind of man you sent when something broke that should not have broken. When a bridge collapsed under loads it had been certified to hold. When a mine-resistant hull failed its promise. When a tank that cost more than a small town died to a weapon that should not have killed it. He believed in three things: that good design saved lives, that American steel was the best in the world, and that no peasant with a cheap launcher could outwit 10 inches of well-angled armor. In Hugh, standing in front of that ruined M48 with the ragged fist-sized hole, Holding a Soviet tube that cost less than the tank's radio, he felt the first crack in that belief. Not outrage yet, not fear, just a precise, unwelcome awareness that somewhere, someone had built a weapon that violated the equation he'd built his life on. "I thought bravery meant not being afraid," he had told a younger lieutenant once, half joking, over coffee in a dry, safe briefing room. "I was wrong," he would think later. Bravery, he was starting to understand, might be admitting that the things you trusted can fail you. The first time Captain James Morrison saw a tank die up close, it wasn't during a test. It was on February 1st, 1968, the second day of the Battle of Hue. He had come north with a Marine convoy from Phu Bai, bringing repair equipment and fuel for the M48s, supporting the infantry. The road into the city was chaos. Smoke columns rising from temples and shop fronts, the air thick with humidity and gunpowder. The Marines called it hell with humidity. Morrison rode in a jeep, following behind a column of 3 M48 Pattons. The tanks moved slowly, their tracks clanking against shattered asphalt, turrets turning in jerky arcs. He could hear short bursts of M60 fire ahead, alley to alley, window to window. Then it happened. The lead tank had just cleared an intersection when a white streak shot out from a doorway on the right. It was so fast it barely registered. A flash, a hiss, a blur of smoke trailing across the street. Morrison saw it hit just behind the turret ring. There was no explosion in the Hollywood sense, no fireball, just a dull crack, followed by a flash of molten orange light bursting out through the commander's hatch. For a split second, it was silent. Then came the scream. The M48's engine revved wildly as the driver, already dead, pressed the throttle. The tank jerked forward, rammed into a wall, and stopped. Flames spilled from the engine vents. Someone inside pounded on the hatch from within. Morrison shouted, "Get it open! Get it open!" But the handle was warped. The steel glowed red. The pounding stopped. By the time the fire team got foam extinguishers up, it was too late. Morrison climbed onto the hull after the fire died. The smell hit him first, burning paint, oil, and flesh. He forced himself to look. The penetration hole was about the width of a man's wrist, just behind the turret. Around it, the paint had bubbled and peeled like old bark. He ran a gloved hand over the metal. The steel was curled inward. The projectile hadn't punched its way in. It had melted its way through. He remembered every speck of that armor. 120 millimeters of cast steel sloped 60 degrees. It should have been invulnerable to anything short of an anti-tank gun. But this had gone straight through like butter. The Marines pulled the bodies out. 3 of them were burned black, welded to their seats. The 4th, the loader, had been halfway through the hatch. His right hand still clutched the handle. His left was gone. Morrison turned away, his stomach tightening. Later, he examined the impact site again, methodically this time, like a scientist trying to stay sane through procedure. He traced the residue around the hole, measured the entry angle with his pocket compass, and bagged fragments of the warhead casing. He knew what it was. Shaped charge penetration. He'd studied it 100 times. But in the textbooks, it was just geometry and velocity, copper lining, and cone angles. Here, it was the difference between a tank crew breathing or burning. A Marine sergeant nearby spat on the ground. "Charlie's got new toys, huh?" Morrison didn't answer. He was staring at the melted armor, the rippled steel edges, the soot still hot to the touch. He thought about the line he'd always used to explain tank survivability. No weapon can defeat armor thicker than its penetration limit. But this wasn't about thickness anymore. This was about something smarter, crueler. That night, he couldn't sleep. In the distance, the city burned in a dozen places at once, tracer fire and red flares painting the sky. Every few minutes, he heard another impact echo through the ruins, a hollow whoomp, then silence. Somewhere out there, another M48 was dying the same way. War wasn't a contest of power anymore. It was a contest of ingenuity. And someone in Moscow had just proven they understood that better than Detroit ever did. When the dust cleared, the only sound left was his own heartbeat. Huos was a graveyard of steel. By the fifth day of the offensive, Captain James Morrison had counted 13 destroyed M48 Pattons within a 2-mile radius of the citadel. Some burned out completely, some still smoldering, others half submerged in flooded streets where the perfume river had spilled over its banks. Each one told the same story. One small hole always on the side or the rear, followed by catastrophic fire. He moved through the city like an archaeologist cataloging the ruins of a fallen civilization. For every tank, he made notes: angle of impact, depth of penetration, position of crew, direction of attack. It wasn't just curiosity. It was disbelief disguised as procedure. He'd grown up believing that American armor was a fact of nature, indestructible by anything handheld. But here, in this maze of shattered houses and broken walls, he saw what one $100 warhead could do to $2 million worth of metal. On February 5th, he joined a Marine platoon clearing the Southern District. They advanced house to house, the M48s rolling behind them like iron guardians. Morrison rode with the commander, Captain Harrington, a man who looked 50 but was 33. Pale eyes, sunburned face, voice raw from shouting over the tank's engine. "You engineers built these things," Harrington said, not accusing, just exhausted. "You ever think they'd die this easy?" Morrison hesitated. "They weren't built for this kind of fight. Streets this narrow, walls this close. It's the worst terrain for armor." Harrington snorted. "Terrain doesn't melt steel." The word stung. He had no answer. Half an hour later, the lead tank stopped at a crossroads. The gunner scanned left, right. Nothing. Morrison's eyes caught a flash, a glint of metal maybe 50 meters ahead in the shattered window of a 2-story building. He opened his mouth to shout. Then the world cracked open. Whoosh! A white streak, a burst of smoke, and then a sound like thunder being swallowed by fire. The rocket hit the second tank in line square in the flank. The turret lifted slightly from the hull, just enough to break its seal. Fire blew through the commander's hatch, a violent orange exhale. The loader inside screamed once, a sound Morrison would never forget, before the ammunition cooked off. The blast wave knocked him off his feet. When he looked up, the tank was gone. Just a burning skeleton of armor, tracks still turning. The Marines were shouting, firing into every window. RPG smoke trails snaked through the air like angry ghosts. They pulled back behind a wall, panting. One Marine sat down hard, laughing hysterically. "Sir, they're everywhere. They're shooting those damn rockets like fireworks." Morrison pressed his back to the wall. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard the distinct pop whoosh again, then another, then 2 more. It was like a rhythm. Reload, aim, fire. Every few seconds, another explosion somewhere in the city. The enemy didn't need artillery. They had shoulder artillery. That night, Morrison sat on a ruined stairwell taking apart one of the captured launchers under the dim light of a flashlight. The parts were astonishingly few, maybe 50 in all. Simple machining, a couple of welds, no complex optics, just a trigger, a firing pin, a venturi tube. The Soviet engineers had stripped the design down to its bones. He made notes, then stopped and stared at the page. It hit him like a cold wave. This weapon wasn't designed for soldiers. It was designed for anyone. You didn't need years of training. You didn't need factories or precision metalworks. You needed courage, a steady hand, and a target big enough to hit. One of the Marines leaned over his shoulder. "What's that thing called again?" "RPG-7, Morrison said. "What's that stand for?" He smiled grimly. "Russian for, you're not safe anywhere." He slept in the open that night, between two burned-out tanks. In the distance, Hugh was still burning, red against the horizon, like the inside of a furnace. He could hear distant gunfire, but quieter now. The battle was turning, but something deeper had shifted inside him. He had come here to study damage. Instead, he was witnessing the death of an entire military philosophy. War, he realized, was no longer about who had the biggest machines. It was about who could make the simplest weapon that killed them. By the time he left Hugh 2 weeks later, he'd packed 6 captured RPG-7s and 14 unexploded rockets into crates labeled engineering material. Return to Aberdeen. The Marines laughed, saying he was sending home junk metal. But Morrison knew better. He wasn't sending back trophies. He was sending a warning. Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland, March 1968. The air smelled of winter and cordite. Rows of armor plates stood on the test range like gravestones, each one marked with chalk numbers. Captain James Morrison stood beside Dr. Eugene Stoner, clipboard in hand, as technicians mounted the strange captured launcher on a simple tripod. It looked almost crude among the polished instruments and high-speed cameras, an intruder from another world. "This is the Soviet RPG-7, Stoner said, adjusting his glasses. "Effective range, about 200 meters. Simple, rugged, reusable. According to your field notes, it's been knocking out M48s in Hugh." Morrison nodded. "Easily? Let's see how easily." They backed off as the range officer raised his hand. The gunner, a corporal trained that very morning, steadied the launcher on his shoulder, aimed at the first test plate 50 meters downrange, and pulled the trigger. The shot was anticlimactic. A soft pop whoosh, a smoky trail, and then impact. The rocket struck dead center. For a second, nothing. Then a flash, a brief bloom of light, and the sound of metal tearing. When the smoke cleared, there was a clean hole through the plate, edges curved inward, like the steel had been sucked in by fire. "Depth," Stoner called. A technician walked forward, measured. "Complete penetration, sir. 260 millimeters of rolled armor." Morrison exhaled slowly. 260. That was nearly the effective thickness of a patent side plate when angled. They repeated the test, this time with a real tank turret salvaged from a wrecked M48. Morrison watched in silence as the rocket struck just below the periscope housing, the exact spot he remembered from Hugh. The same flash, the same dull crack. When they examined it, the jet had burned clean through 12 inches of armor, then splattered molten copper across the interior. Inside the turret, the smell was sickening, scorched paint and vaporized steel. The seats were blistered. One of the crew mannequins had a hole through its chest. Dr. Stoner turned to Morrison. "You see what I see?" Yes, Morrison said. A tank that costs $2 million dying to a $500 weapon. They moved to the observation platform. In the cold light of afternoon, the tank looked like a monument to a failed idea. For the next 2 weeks, they dissected the weapon piece by piece. Morrison led the teardown, documenting every component. The venturi cone, the percussion trigger, the optical sight. He found nothing resembling complexity. No circuits, no electronics, no precision machining, just steel, brass, and simplicity turned into genius. "It's so inelegant," one of the younger engineers muttered. "That's what makes it terrifying," Morrison replied. "Anyone can build this. Anyone can use it." When the report was complete, Morrison was invited to brief the Pentagon. The conference room in Arlington was windowless, sterile, the kind of place where wars were turned into spreadsheets. Generals, colonels, contractors in gray suits. He stood at the projector, clicked through his slides. Photo 1, M48 patent, Hugh, destroyed. Photo 2, RPG-7 launcher beside its victim. Photo 3, cross-section of PG-7V warhead showing copper liner and conical charge. Photo 4, test results from Aberdeen, penetration versus distance. He spoke calmly, but every word carried weight. "Gentlemen, this is not a battlefield anomaly. It's a paradigm shift. The RPG-7 represents a fundamental challenge to armored warfare as we know it. For the cost of one of our tanks, the Soviets can build 4,000 of these. They can arm every squad, every guerrilla, every insurgent. Our tanks are no longer kings. They're targets." One general interrupted. "Captain, are you suggesting we abandon armor entirely?" "No, sir," Morrison said evenly. "I'm suggesting we evolve it. Because if we don't, the next war will." He outlined the 2 possible solutions, reactive armor and composite armor, concepts that sounded like science fiction to the brass. Explosive tiles that detonated outward to neutralize the jet. Ceramic layers that scattered energy. Expensive, complex, but necessary. When the briefing ended, the room was silent. One of the older officers finally said, "Son, what you're describing could cost billions." Morrison looked at him. "So will losing the next war." That night, he wrote in his journal, the same one he'd carried since Hugh. "I used to believe steel was safety. Now I know it's only time. Time borrowed until someone invents a better way to kill it. The Soviets did, and they did it for the price of a television set." The next morning, he was reassigned to liaison with the Armor Development Board. Quiet work, but it meant access to classified projects. The seeds of what would become the M1 Abrams, the Chobham plates, the era of reactive defense. Still, he couldn't shake the image of that first burning tank in Hugh, the hole no bigger than his hand, and the young loader frozen in the hatch. Technology had always been his language of control. Numbers, materials, physics. But now, standing on the edge of a new kind of war, he understood that control was an illusion. The future had arrived, and it came in the shape of a $500 tube of steel and fire. Spring 1969. Aberdeen was quiet again. The tests were done, the reports filed. The engineers moved on to new projects, new tanks, new armor, new ways to delay the inevitable. But Captain James Morrison stayed behind. He walked the test range alone most mornings, coffee cooling in his hand, the fog hanging low over the burned hulks. There was something haunting about them. Rows of dead machines, silent except for the wind moving through the twisted turrets. Each one had a small white placard hammered into the ground. RPG-7, 100 meter, 150, 200 mil, They looked less like research data and more like tombstones. He'd once believed that progress in war was a straight line. Stronger steel, thicker armor, better weapons. But standing there, looking at the holes that went straight through that steel, he saw that it was more like a circle. Each innovation only birthed its opposite. Someone would always find a cheaper way to kill it. He thought often of the tank crews at Hugh. He'd written their names in his notebook beside the diagrams. Lieutenant Harold Krieger, Sergeant Frank Petty, CPL James Lew, Port Tomas Rivera. 4 men who never saw the weapon that killed them. He'd promised himself their deaths would teach something. But now, with months gone by, he wasn't sure anyone wanted to learn. He met one of the Pentagon colonels again that April. The man shook his hand firmly, smiling the polite smile of bureaucratic victory. "You started something big, Morrison. The new composite armor project's moving ahead. You'll see results within a decade." Morrison nodded, but his voice was hollow. "And until then?" The colonel shrugged. "Until then, we hope nobody fights a war we're not ready for." Hope. That was the official strategy. He was promoted to major that summer, sent to a design bureau in Detroit to advise on survivability engineering. He worked long nights drafting armor layouts, reviewing ceramic configurations, calculating explosive spacing for reactive tiles. His equations were perfect. They always were. But the feeling that trailed him never went away. Every time he saw the cross-section of a tank, he thought of the loader's hand gripping the hatch handle. Every time he saw the words crew survivability, he thought of what burning steel smelled like in tropical rain. War had left the battlefield, but not his head. He started keeping his journal differently, no longer notes or data, but fragments, thoughts that came at midnight. Every generation builds a better shield. Every generation invents a sharper spear. The future isn't safer, it's just more efficient. The weapon that changed war wasn't built for soldiers, it was built for everyone. He tried to talk to Claire about it, but she had grown used to his silences. She would find him in the garage, staring at a cutaway of an RPG warhead he kept in a glass case. Once she asked, "Why keep it?" He said quietly, "Because it reminds me how cheap death can be." When he finally left the Army in 1972, his hair had gone gray at the temples. He went into private consulting, designing armored vehicles for police and contractors. Small work, peaceful work, or so he told himself. But every design meeting, every cost estimate, ended with the same question he could never escape. How much is a life worth today? Sometimes, on quiet evenings, he'd turn on the television and see footage from other wars. Beirut, Angola, Afghanistan. Same trails of smoke, same explosions, same weapon. The RPG-7 had outlived him. He'd pause the screen, watching the white arc of a rocket as it flew toward another tank, another generation of soldiers who believed their armor would save them. It never did. When the guns fell silent in his own life, the echoes stayed. In the corners of his mind, in the steel blueprints he couldn't stop drawing, in the memory of fire eating through armor like paper. He had spent his career building walls, and now he understood. The world never stopped finding ways to burn through them. By the time Major James Morrison retired for good in 1987, the world he'd helped shape had changed beyond recognition. The Cold War was still breathing, tense, metallic, paranoid. But the new tanks rolling off production lines no longer looked like the ones he'd known. The M1 Abrams, the Leopard 2, the Challenger. He saw them all in glossy defense brochures. Angular beasts with layered armor and secret composites. Their turrets seemed to glow under floodlights, their surfaces smooth and confident. They were in many ways monuments to fear, every inch of them born from the lessons of that $500 launcher in Hue. He remembered the Pentagon conference 15 years earlier when a general had scoffed at his warnings. "Captain, are you suggesting we rebuild the tank from scratch?" He had, and they did. Now, each of those tanks carried inside it the ghosts of every M48 that burned in that Vietnamese city. Beneath the Chalbam ceramic tiles and the depleted uranium mesh, there were still men, still flesh, still the same fragile hearts that believed steel could save them. In 1982, when Israel's tanks rolled into Lebanon, Morrison followed the reports obsessively. He read that the new Blazer reactive armor had saved dozens of vehicles from destruction. For a moment, he felt something like pride. Progress, at last. Then came the next paragraph. RPG-7s with new tandem warheads had pierced the upgraded tanks. The balance had already shifted again. He closed the newspaper and whispered to himself, "They learn faster than we do." He began to understand that he hadn't just studied a weapon. He had witnessed the birth of a philosophy. The RPG-7 was not merely a tube of steel, it was a statement. It said, "You can't outspend ingenuity." Every time he visited defense expos in his consulting years, he saw it. Booth after booth of anti-armor weapons, some laser-guided, some infrared-tracked. But the old Soviet launcher still sat there, unchanged, displayed in a corner with its same simple wooden grip and curved shoulder rest. And still, the line of visitors around it was longer than for anything else. One day, a young lieutenant recognized him at an industry conference. "Sir, aren't you the Morrison from the Aberdeen report? Project Hard Target?" He nodded, slightly embarrassed. The lieutenant grinned. "They made us read that in training. You were right about everything. We just didn't know it yet." Morrison smiled faintly. "I wish I'd been wrong." He walked the expo floor that afternoon with a strange feeling, pride mixed with sorrow. The future was dazzling, yes, but every new weapon looked like another line on the same circular path. He thought about what the RPG-7 had really changed. It wasn't just armor design, it was the relationship between power and vulnerability. It made every soldier on Earth understand that technology would never make them invincible, that every empire, no matter how rich, could still be humbled by one man with steady hands and a cheap launcher. History had already proven it. Afghanistan, Lebanon, Somalia, Iraq. The same hiss of rocket flight, the same flash of orange light, the same fear in the eyes of men who thought their armor was enough. He often sat on his porch in those later years, watching his grandchildren play, the evening air quiet. The world was different, yet not. Tanks still rolled in foreign streets, rockets still flew, and humanity still kept pretending that thicker walls could hold back the truth. He once wrote in his final notebook, "The RPG didn't end tanks. It ended the illusion that money could buy safety." The real weapon it created wasn't the rocket. It was the idea that simplicity, multiplied, can topple anything. We built fortresses. They built holes. When he died in 1991, the news barely noticed. One paragraph in a military engineering journal, a few lines in the obituaries section. But in the armored warfare community, his 1968 report was legend, still cited, still taught, still relevant. And somewhere in the ruins of another war, half a world away, A young fighter lifted a launcher older than himself, aimed, and fired. The same weapon, the same sound, the same consequence. History had a way of repeating, Morrison thought before the end. But it wasn't fate. It was just that we never truly listened. This was one man's story. A quiet engineer who once believed steel could save lives and who spent the rest of his years realizing that no wall, no armor, no invention ever could. Major James Morrison didn't die in battle. He died in peace, in a quiet home thousands of miles from Hugh. But in a way, part of him never left that burning street in 1968, standing over a tank melted by a weapon so small, so simple, it rewrote everything he thought he knew about war. The RPG-7 outlived him. It outlived the Cold War, the empires that built it, and the generations who tried to replace it. It remains, 5 decades later, a $500 machine that changed the balance of power forever. Because the truth Morrison discovered still echoes today. Technology can evolve, armor can harden, strategies can shift, but human ingenuity will always find the crack in the wall. He once wrote in the last line of his journal, "If war ever ends, it won't be because we built stronger tanks. It'll be because we finally stop building things to destroy them." So if you're listening to this somewhere safe, in your home, your car, maybe a quiet night halfway across the world, take a moment to think about that. How a $500 tube of steel forced the most powerful armies on Earth to rethink everything they knew about survival. How progress and destruction often walk hand in hand, and how one man, holding that weapon in his hands for the first time, understood that simplicity can be the deadliest form of genius. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Tell me your city, and tell me this. Do you think humanity will ever stop designing better ways to kill itself?